Mr. Brian Bogert, I am so honored that you're here today to be on the podcast. It really means a lot to me. Thank you so much for being part of this.
Dude, it's a pleasure. Being connected through Mike Ayala, which is just a pure human being, and the little bit of time that you and I've spent with each other. I mean, I'm here because you're putting good into the world, and I just want to be a part of that.
Oh, man, I'm so blessed to have you here. I'm really excited for this conversation. We were talking before we started recording, I really spent a lot of time preparing, and not because I wanted to have you get all the good stuff out of you, which you are putting such great content out there, and it's all free so people can get it. But even for me selfishly, I have so many questions that I want to ask about no limits living and, how to deal with pain and suffering and all these mind and cognitive health things that you're talking about in your subject matter. And so I'm really excited to get into this. You're really a subject matter expert about all this stuff. So let's start with, and I want to give people some context because your history and your background gives a lot of context to sort of the work you're doing now and why you have the mission of creating impact in 1 billion people's lives, which I love that mission, by the way. But can you give us a short background about sort of how you got here and what your journey has been to get you to do this work?
Yeah, absolutely. So, I'm really big on the who before what. So I'll start with that, right? Give you a little feeling of who I am, right? And at a high level, I'm a husband and father first. That is hands down the most important role that I play. And it is the only thing that's truly binary in my world, because if my wife and my kids are not good, then I will walk away from everything. And so that I just have to start with, because that'll help you guys understand and center in who I am, so that everything from this point forward, that's the lens I view the world. I was in a really unique situation at a young age. And my mom, my brother, and I had gone to our local Walmart just to get a 1-inch paintbrush to finish up some stuff that we were working on. And as we were heading back to the car, was waiting for my mom to catch up. This was back in the days of key fobs. So I had to wait for her to put a physical key in the door and unlock it. And as I was standing there, a truck pulls up in front of the store. Driver and passenger park and get out. And the passenger all the way to the right felt the truck moving backwards. So he did what any one of us would do, Ashish, and he scooted over to put his foot on the brake, but he instead hit the gas. Combination of shock and force threw him up on the steering wheel, up on the dashboard. And before you know it, he was catapulting 40 miles an hour across the parking lot right at us with no time to react. So went up and over the median, went up over the tree in the median, hit our car, knocked me over, ran over me diagonally, tearing my spleen and leaving a tire track scar on my stomach, and continuing on to sever my left arm completely from my body. So this was August 10th, 1992, 115-degree day. I'm now laying on the pavement. My mom and my brother watch the whole thing happen. They look up and they see my arm laying 10 feet away. Fortunately for me, my guardian angel also saw the whole thing happen. There was a nurse that walked out of the store right when this took place. And she saw the literal life and limb scenario in front of her. And I'm forever indebted to this woman for her decision to go into action versus just go on with her day.
Right.
She came over and stopped the bleeding on the main wound and saved my life. She also instructed some innocent bystanders to run inside, grab a cooler with ice, fill it with ice, and get my detached limb on ice within minutes. Had she not done one or both of those things, Ashish, I either wouldn't be here with you today, or I'd be here with you today with a cleaned up stump. That's just the reality.
Cleaned up stump, right.
I know that you knew that part of the story, right? But I'm sure that your listeners did not. And so the thing I always have to say is I know that I have a very unique story. But what I also know after all this time of doing this is that we all have unique stories. So what's important is that we pause and become aware of the lessons we can extract from those stories, and then become intentional with how do we apply them in our lives. And so I'll share with you 2 quick ones, and I'm going to brush through this really fast. We're not going to go into the full detail of where they came from, but these are 2 that guide my life. I learned early not to get stuck by what has happened to me, but instead get moved by what I can do with it. And the other lesson that I learned is to embrace pain to avoid suffering in my life. It's these lessons that we use to not only overcome this unique injury, but how my business partners and I scaled our last business in risk management, employee benefits consulting to over 15 million with the span of a decade. And now how we flip that on its head through our 4 different entities to be able to help people become more aware, more intentional, and who they already are, their most authentic selves. Because I believe that's when magic happens and the door starts to crack to perspective, motivation, and direction. That's why we're on a mission to impact 1 billion lives, because if we can reduce the level of suffering on this planet, allow us all to experience more joy, freedom, and fulfillment holistically, bring vulnerability and authenticity, which are the glue that binds human connection, back into the forefront, then all of a sudden we get to live happier, more fulfilled, more connected lives. And it's going to leave a better world for your kids and mine.
So many places. Firstly, I want to honor you because there's a lot of people, you're right, who have had their own stories and go through whatever traumatic experience, whether it's physical or emotional experience in their life. But the way that you're pivoting that and really trying to serve and trying to add value and trying to create impact, I just want to honor you for that. And I want you to know that I know that it takes effort and it takes intention and it takes energy. And so I just appreciate that and honor you for that. But let's get into this idea that you coin, and you talk a lot about this, about no limits living. And I mean, and you'll layer into this, I know, as you answer this, but as we live our life, we have all these conditional beliefs, we have these limiting beliefs, we have these, and even in your journey, all the things you learned before and after your accident. What does limitless living really even mean? Is it even possible? Can we get out of our own way? Talk about that for us.
Yeah. So I believe that we are all confined and trapped by not only the limits that the world has placed on us, but especially the limits we place upon ourselves, many of which are conditioned into us by the external world, but we own as our own.
Right.
Okay. So the reality of it is when I see what we are truly capable of, it is far beyond what most people give themselves credit for.
Right.
If you think about even the way that we goal plan and goal set, we most of the time protect ourselves in the way that we think in the future because of some limiting belief that exists, right? So if we know we need to lose 25 pounds, we're going to start by saying, I'm going to lose 10, right? And the reality of it is even when we do that, we've limited ourselves, because the reality of it is we're going to hit probably 80 to 90% proficiency on the goals that we set. But if we set them too low to protect ourselves, then we're going to default to that lowest common denominator. Mm-hmm. Whereas if instead you said, I'm going to instead lose 30, you might lose that 25 and it'll seem like it was easy. But if you say I'm going to lose 10, you'll probably lose 8, but give yourself credit for it. And you actually limited yourself beyond where you really could be. When we think about how often this happens in the way that we operate, it makes sense. From the time we are little kids, we are told all the things that we should do, shouldn't do, can do, can't do. It's appropriate to be here. It's appropriate to be there. And we just start living inside the confines of this box that the world will approve of who we are. Know that we can exist in there. And so no limits living starts with awareness and intentionality to make sure that you align with who you authentically are. I'm sure we'll talk about that as well.
Yes.
But no limits living is not that you can do anything. Guess what? I had my arm ripped off. The likelihood of me going to a professional basketball player is pretty low. Now I'm a pretty damn good athlete and I can hang in a 3x3 tournament, but I'm not going to the pros because I don't have the physical ability. Right? I'm likely not going to go serve in our military because I don't meet the physical standards. Regardless of what I can do, there is a standard for safety that they put in place to ensure that our troops come home safely. I don't meet the standard. So can I live truly and do anything that I set my mind to and be completely limitless? No. But I can guarantee you that I am capable of a hell of a lot more than most people give me the opinion for. Right? The amount of times that people looked at me in the eye when I had my arm ripped off at 7 and 8 years old, and they asked me what happened and I tell them what took place, and their jaws would drop and they'd look to my parents for validation because they didn't believe my own story. They were viewing me through what their lens was showing them they'd be capable of in my situation. Had nothing to do with who I was.
Right.
And so the assumption that I couldn't learn to water ski with one hand, I couldn't learn to tie my shoes with one hand, I couldn't learn to ride and balance on a bike without training wheels, all these things that at 7, 8, 9, 10, people said are impossible, I did. Now, part of that was because I created an intellectual narrative to go shoot that. But the reality of it is I proved to myself very early that having my arm reattached, yeah, does it give me more challenges? It certainly does. But does it mean I'm limited? No, I'm limitless based on the way I choose to live my life.
Did you, as you were going through your healing journey, both emotionally and physically, and really getting to this wavelength, what showed up for you throughout the process? Was it like obstacle after obstacle that you decided, you know what, I'm just not going to have it anymore? Was it like, no, before and after, I've always had this mindset. I just had now a different obstacle that I had to deal with. Was it this what was really driving the intention to constantly search for something that was limitless? And then I guess my second part question is, what have you experienced or what have you come across that you didn't expect in your limitless journey?
Oh, wow. Those are both really good questions. You might have to remind me of the second one when we get there.
No problem.
I think I'll
start
retain
with
it,
the
but if I
first
don't,
one.
then you'll have to remind me. Both very good questions. I would tell you that it is a combination of nature and nurture, this philosophy that I have. Mm-hmm. If I'm being really, really honest with myself, it is both. Right. And my shame wouldn't have allowed me to say that externally because of pride or ego in the past.
Right.
But I actually believe that my accident gave me more perspective than it gave me anything. It did not give me drive. It gave me perspective. Drive I had. Perspective is what allowed me to shape this idea of limits and no limits. Okay. When I say drive, I was the guy that literally at 2.5 went to my dad and told him to take the training wheels off my bike because I didn't want them on there anymore.
Right.
And he said, "You realize you're going to crash and burn?" And I said, "Yes." Take my training wheels off. And I got on my bike and I rode it. Now, the only way I could stop is I couldn't use the brakes and put my feet down because it was a 12-inch bike and my legs were too short. So the only way I could stop is by crashing it. So I learned to crash intentionally to slow myself down and stop. But to give you some perspective, again, that's not me saying that to impress, it's to impress upon the point. I was already going to challenge the boundaries on certain things just because of who I was.
Right.
But my humility, my understanding, my empathy, my compassion for what true challenges look like changed because at 2.5 to be able to do that, things came easy to me.
Right.
They no longer came easy to me.
Right.
Right. But I also did have a chip on my shoulder because I was tired of other people telling me what I couldn't do. You want to ensure I'm going to live limitless? Tell me I can't do something.
There it is.
And I'm going to find a way to do it. Right. So for a long time, it was fueled by a chip on my shoulder to prove to the world that this was not going to define me. It was not going to trap me. But if I'm being honest, I had to prove that to myself.
I love that. And to the second question, and you're on this amazing trajectory too, is what is showing up for you that you never even imagined as, like, if you were to, like, 10 years ago say, this is my most limitless life, and these are all the things I'm going to be able to accomplish, that's probably 100x to where you are right now, this moment. But like, what showed up over the last couple of years or your recent history of like, holy crap, I didn't even think that was going to show up for me, and just taking you to a whole nother level? Like, what are you experiencing in that?
Yeah. So, I mean, there's a lot of different ways I can go with this because there's a lot.
Right.
If I'm just being honest,
I know.
Not like a singular thing.
A lot of things are manifesting.
I'm going to focus on two. Okay. And I'm going to say two because they encapsulate the last 5-ish years and the last year very clearly in two separate ways. Something that I never expected to limitless life is I had convinced myself that to live a limitless life, I just had to have mental toughness. But you said earlier, as you were going through your healing physically, right? Emotionally. I didn't emotionally start healing for almost 25 years after my accident. And I didn't know it. Okay. I had built an intellectual narrative that was, I'm good, I'm strong, I'm capable, I can do anything myself. And oh, by the way, that everything I set my mind to, I accomplished.
Right.
But I didn't realize that I also wasn't feeling and I wasn't paying attention to what was actually taking place, and it was limiting me.
Right.
You see, I don't believe that those who reach the highest level of performance are those that just have a strong mental toughness. In fact, I'm on a mission to make sure that we stop talking about just mentality and mental toughness because they aren't in isolation. It's not a mutually exclusive concept. Those that reach the highest level of performance are those that understand their intellectual and emotional narratives. Right. Where they are originally hardwired and how to balance and regulate between the two narratives to know which one is real in the moment. Those are the ones that see the world most accurately versus through a tainted lens that we've been conditioned into us. Now, that's where the concept of thinking about our thinking about our feeling, feel our thinking and feel our feeling came from, because it's in that quadrant that success lives. So with this idea of limitless, that was a surprise to me. I thought if I set my mind to it, I could do it. Now I've realized that my emotions can actually determine whether or not I'm successful on any venture. The second piece to that I want to say that I was going to focus on is how much awareness we are able to gain through our children and how our children can actually help us unlock to another level of being limitless.
So talk more about that.
They are mirrors of us. If you think about it, the things that keep us stuck are not the wrong strategy and tactics in our life. It's usually a combination of emotional triggers, behavioral patterns, and environmental conditioning.
Yes.
Which largely suggests that who we are is also passed down by generations, that we inherit a lot of these triggers and behaviors and environmental conditions. So it's not a surprise that when your kids start getting 6, 7, and they're developing their own personalities, you see how much of a mirror they are to us.
Absolutely.
We see that the areas that we face resistance and energy drain with our children, particularly the ones that are more like us than like our partners, is actually we're harder on them in the areas that we already don't feel whole ourselves. Our kids are reflections, and they expose the areas that we still need to focus. And I didn't see that coming. I just didn't see that coming. And my kids have actually been some of my greatest mentors, teachers, and coaches in the last 3 years over anyone else in my life, because they've allowed me to see myself more clearly so I can serve them better.
That hits me home so specifically right now too. And I hope that it is relevant to other people too, because, you know, this is the holiday season. We have a lot of family time. I just did a 10-day RV trip with my girls, and, you know, locked into a little RV. And I have
before. That's a lot.
And I have a 2-year-old and a 4-year-old, and trust me, we get some close quarters. And what you're talking about is so true, that, you know, when there are times where they trigger us, or we get frustrated, or we are upset at them, or they do something to upset us, and I'm using air quotes, it's really about us and how we parent. And most of that comes from our parenting, or what, you know, the way our parent, or we saw that modeled. I guess
so outside of parenting, Ashish, I want to interrupt just for a second.
Yeah.
I think it's really important to understand this. It's not just parenting style.
Right.
It's actually a greater level of awareness for ourselves. So for example, I am a lot like my son. We're wired intellectually very similarly, and we have some of the same behavioral patterns in terms of some of the stuff that we have, sensory needs or whatever. Right. My daughter is more of a clone to my wife. Now, it's interesting because I have 15 years of experience with my wife, and I'm like a miracle worker with my daughter. My wife has 15 years of experience with me, and she's like a miracle worker with my son. Where does my resistance and energy drain come from? It's in my blind spots on myself that are exposed through my son. And so my wife is actually coaching me on how to better interact with my son because of her understanding on who I am and the ways she's had to cater to my own intricacies over the last 15 years, and vice versa. So when I see conflict with my wife and daughter, it's not parenting style. They are so similar, they can't see what's happening. And my wife is disciplining based on something that is actually a blind spot for her, and vice versa for me. And so now I'm in a position to be empowered to help coach my wife to see herself more clearly so she can better serve our daughter and our son. But it's the same thing, it's a two-way street. So what it's actually doing is it has nothing to do with parenting style, because again, behavioral patterns, emotional triggering, environmental conditioning.
It's all about us.
Those are things we inherit. It's all about us. It's how we operate and exist. And think about it. Most of what our kids absorb is not what we tell them or teach them. It's what they witness we do. So when my son was having problems with anger, guess what? The root of that was my anger.
Right. And
I had to get control of that.
So whether you thought you were being angry or not, you saw that as a reflection, and you're like, there must be some behavioral pattern that I'm exposing to him that is causing his sense of anger, or his feelings or emotions of anger.
So I could discipline him on the anger and say, hey, this is wrong. Or I can say, what model have I set for him?
Because he's
even if I haven't screamed at my son, does he see anger? Does he see me emote anger? Does he see frustration? Does he see resentment? Does he see those things bubbling up? And if so, I don't want to feel that way. So one, I've got to get better control of it for myself. But two, instead of disciplining him because of the reaction of that anger, saying that that's not appropriate, that's not good, instead I can now be empowered to sit back and realize I can coach him through that as well. I can help him understand what he's feeling. Why is he feeling that? What actually sparked it? And so what took place a couple of weeks ago is he was in a scenario where he snapped at his sister and they got into a fight. He was out of line. And so I went back and I was like, bro, like what happened? Because he snapped at his mom too, right after that. And I went in there and I said, awareness moment, dude. He goes, what? I said, so I think that you didn't feel seen and understood because you were actually trying to help your sister. And he goes, yeah. And I got really frustrated because she clearly didn't know that. And I said, yeah, but what happened? He goes, well, she did this and I didn't feel understood. So I reacted. Yeah. And then what happened? Well, I was screaming. What emotion were you feeling? I got angry. Yeah. Well, what happened for the 5 minutes after that? Oh, well, mom asked me to do this and I reacted to her and she got upset at me for being angry, but I didn't think I was being angry. Yeah. So it carried over, right? Yeah, it did. Here's an awareness moment for you, bro. You just created damage and you didn't even realize you did it. And he goes, what do you mean? I said, well, your sister's now upset. She feels like you were trying to take over and control it. Your mom has no idea where the anger came from. And you snapped at both of them and neither one of them saw it coming. And he goes,
awareness
yeah.
moment.
Said, how did that make you feel? And he goes, yucky. And I said, how do we repair it? He goes, I need to go own my emotions with them. 5 minutes later, I come back and he's talking to his sister and he says, hey, when we just did this, he said, I was trying to help you. And the way that you responded made me feel like you didn't understand what I was trying to do. And instead of calming down and telling you in that moment that you didn't understand what I was saying, I reacted, blew up and got angry and I screamed at you. And I'm sorry if I did that because I don't think that you were expecting it.
You're
now
not going to.
What I've done is I've empowered my son to better understand his feelings, how it's coming across, and how to better communicate around what's taking place in his world. Again, you could argue that's a parenting style, but until I understood my own anger, there was no ability for me to talk him through that.
Correct. Well, I mean, as a millennial and as a conscious parent or working on being more conscious and being more, I love that awareness moment or teaching moment, right? Such a good lesson there. There's an entire generation of people who do not understand what the hell you're talking about. And it's part of why you're doing the work. And I think is the blessing of creating this content and sharing it with people to connect with their feelings and work through conflict, anger, suffering, pain, regret, what have you, and really going down to the feeling and the emotion. I guess what's my question? My question is, I guess, what do you, as you do the work, I mean, the way I think about it is it's the amount of information that is now available to us as a millennial generation or what have you, as a technology generation, there's a lot of people who still suffer in their own patterns.
That's right.
Right? They still suffer either keeping their emotions inside, they react, they get triggered, they respond. Like, what's really going on? Why does that exist? And how come we haven't learned through that yet?
Yeah, so I want to ask you a quick question before I answer that, because that's a beautiful question and I know where I'm going to go with it. But you said there's an entire generation that doesn't understand this concept. I want to make sure that I'm very clear. Which generation are you talking about?
That's a great question. And I don't want to be limiting to specifically like a generation. So I need to rephrase the question. I guess I'm not talking more about a generation. I'm really talking about whether you have intention to create a level of awareness or you have no intention or maybe even ignorance to create that level of attention.
Okay, fair enough. So that's more of an overarching trait that we see developing in society than the specific generation as we would define it based on ages or windows.
Yeah, thanks for calling me out on that, because you're right. It's not a generational thing.
Because I really wanted to be clear, because what I was going to say to you is I don't think that there's just a generation that doesn't understand this concept. I think all generations alive currently don't completely understand this concept.
You're right.
Myself included, by the way. I'm leaning in and learning more every single day.
Correct.
Right. So you call me a subject matter expert. That's great. I only have as much knowledge as my experience gives me. Right. I hope that in another 30 years, I might actually be a subject matter expert. Okay. But reality of it is when we look at this, like how does this happen? How does this develop? And why don't we have the ability to get ourselves out? Okay. Like what's happening inside our bodies? How are we actually operating? Okay.
Right.
Think about it in the realm of like how we start in this world. We start as our brightest, most authentic, burning light we will ever be. Think about it. You've got a 2-year-old and a 4-year-old.
Yeah.
You know this. Those girls are raw, right? They're raw. You know who they are. There's no question. And they don't even question or change their responses and actions until they're about 5, 6, 7, right? Like you see who they are. They're raw. They can't control it. And then what happens? Parents, teachers, coaches, employers start layering on all these rules of society. And all these shoulds. You should do this, you shouldn't do that. You should be this, you shouldn't be that. You should chase this, you shouldn't chase that. You should want this amount of money, you shouldn't want that amount of money. Should in and of itself is a shame-based word because it implies whatever you're doing, whoever you are is not good enough unless it fits inside the should, right? So one of the first things we can all start doing is let's start removing the word should from our language because it's immediately limiting and confining. So instead of telling yourself tomorrow morning or this afternoon, I should have woke up earlier this morning and worked out. Change it to a future focused and objective perspective and say, what could I do differently tomorrow to ensure my success in working out and getting up early? What would I have done differently if I had known my inability to get up because of this variable? Analyze it, don't shame it. But think about that. From the time we are kids, we are embedded these messages that who we are is not good enough. But if we focus on the human experience, it's rooted in 4 things. We all seek and desire to feel safe. We all seek and desire to feel protected. Those are not the same thing, by the way. We all seek and desire to feel seen and understood. And we all seek and desire to be connected. Guess what? Connected is what we desire the most. Yet it's the one thing that seems so unattainable because it doesn't exist unless the first three do. So what happens when we feel like we're not good enough? Who we are is not good enough. What we're doing is not good enough. Do we feel safe?
No.
Do we feel seen and understood? Do we feel protected? Do we feel connected? No. So what do? We put our wall up because we can protect ourselves and make ourselves feel safe, because then at least we get 2 of the 4.
So
we won't be seen and understood. We won't be connected, but we will have the first 2. So instead, right, start paying attention to the fact that when we put our wall up, we are preventing what we actually want as well. Because once that wall goes up, how can somebody see through our armor? How can they understand us through our armor? How can we connect with someone through our own armor? We can't. True strength actually lies behind vulnerability. Yeah. And the only way we lower that armor is by shedding the layers of it systematically over time. We can't just decide my armor is gone because we have years of conditioning. But we can start shedding it incrementally in layers until we get back to the core of who we are and we no longer need to carry it. But think about the armor. Not only do we prevent what we want, but it's heavy.
It's heavy.
Imagine carrying 2 5-pound dumbbells in front of you. How long can you hold those, Ashish?
Right. Not very long.
The longer you hold them, the heavier they get, right?
Yeah, the longer. Yeah, somebody once told me, what's the weight of a glass of water? It depends on how long you hold it,
and how far in front of you hold it.
That's right.
Right, and so if we understand that the armor that we protect ourselves with is actually 1, preventing us, but 2, it's systematically and incrementally crushing us over time. Because when we bottle this up and we follow the world, which is what they tell us, don't feel, show up and put a smile on. Don't pay attention to your emotions. Shit, there's a book out right now, and I need to talk to the author, by the way, because I need to and read it. I need to give him justice because I've ripped on the book, but I've not read it. So I need to do justice. But it's called Fuck Your Feelings. What? Like, I can't wrap my head around that. But the reality of it is, if that's the narrative of the world, think about the field book for the Army. 1945 field book had 140 plus references to the emotion and the human experience. Today's 0. Situational awareness, organizational awareness, leadership. None of it has to do with the human experience. It's all around leadership, tactics, strategy and tactics. The human experience has been lost even in the way that we train our military. So if we know this, and they always tell us to chop it off, guess what? We bottle it up. We keep it up inside this compartment. Guess what? When we're holding onto armor, the other thing that happens, the third byproduct of it is the pressure builds over time until at one point we explode. And so why does this happen? Because when we come into the world, we aren't protected in most of our environments. When I say safe and protected are not the same thing, I make sure that my wife and kids are protected in the house, which means that I see and understand them, I connect with them, and I make sure they were safe. So as a leader in a house or in a business, often what happens is we don't feel seen and understood or connected because we're just like everybody else. So we have our armor up. How can we protect others when we have armor around ourselves?
True.
Right? So instead, as leaders in business or in life, we need to challenge ourselves to lower that armor and create a field of armor around whatever environment we're in. Because if we can create the protection, everyone else in it is safe. They don't have to have their armor up. They can start lowering theirs. Now all of a sudden we can connect with them, make them feel seen and understood, and they already feel safe because the armor we've created. They don't have to carry their own.
One of the things that I was so excited about talking to you today, because in my own journey, and again, in preparation for this podcast, I was like, man, what has shown up for me in the last few years in some of the work that Brian is talking about, and what limits did I experience and what was showing up for me? And you had talked about, connection and feeling safe. But for me, I had such a strong fear of looking bad, fear of, I had a strong fear of looking bad, a fear of failure, and a pretty strong codependence. And what that means is that I was so dependent on what other people thought of me, saw me, gave me. And so when I think about the limitless living in my own life, very recently, those 3 things showed up, and it prevented me. And I'd love your feedback, but it prevented me from exactly what you're talking about, is showing up as a leader, protecting protecting your team, protecting your customers, protecting your family, because you had all of these body armor things on, which you think are protecting you. but they're actually holding you back and really, in my circumstance, really preventing me from moving forward at all. Like literally in this feedback loop.
Stuck is not strategy and tactics.
It's not.
If you've gone out and bought another 7-step system on success, you wouldn't be breaking free through that. What you're actually doing is putting yourself inside your body to pay attention to it. Okay,
and you said it. And you said it intellectually. You can work through it. Like I'm gonna work harder. I'm gonna be smarter. I'm gonna do better routines. Blah blah blah.
But until you feel you do not heal. Period. End of story. And I mean that in your own life and in the lives of those around you. You don't heal the damage you've created intentionally or unintentionally because of the reactions that you've had rooted in your triggers. You talked about fear. Each one of those 3 fears, I don't believe that fear, by the way, is a root emotion. It's a secondary emotion. We are afraid and we get fear, like we get actual afraid in the fight or flight sense that's triggered for pure survival. But fear in all of those things isn't real fear. That's actually rooted in shame, even codependency.
Right. It was all rooted in shame.
And that fear is the secondary emotion. That's how I'm experiencing the emotion. But the reality of it is the root emotion isn't fear. You can't just move through that. Right. Now, if we want to simplify it and focus it on fear, Dr. Susan Jeffers has a book called Feel the Fear and Do It Anyway. And the level 3 fears, which she says are the root of all fears, is basically the answer to the question, can I handle it? Right? And her response is, if we know we can handle anything that gets thrown at us, if we know that we'll be okay, then what do we actually have to be afraid of? Right? You're afraid of being dependent on other people. You're afraid of being judged. You're afraid of failure.
That's what it's all about.
All 3 of those 3 things, like the question there is, can I handle it? Can I handle being judged? Can I handle if I fail? Right? And can I handle, doing it on my own without depending on other people? But the reality of it is that's not the question that we need to be having, because you can do that intellectually. We know you can.
Intellectually, yes.
We need to feel it so that we can heal it. Okay. And so what we've done is we've created, and we call it the inside out method. It's actually giving people a different way of operating when they identify emotions, and particularly emotions that are keeping them stuck or creating damage in their world. Because again, it's not strategy and tactics. It's emotional triggers, behavioral patterns, environmental conditioning. So the inside out starts with awareness. Okay. And I'm going to go through this really fast, and we can.
Well, here's everyone needs to listen
out there,
because this is the hack right here. The hack is coming.
The hack is coming. Okay. Aware. We have to be first aware, right? We have to be aware that the emotion is impacting us and that it's impacted areas in our life, and that we have to be able to know that, right? We have to be aware, right? So for me, I had to be aware that shame impacted me in my life. I had to be aware that it impacted me professionally. It impacted me in my house. It impacted my personal relationships. It impacted the work I did in the community. Truly, all of those things shame impacted. I wasn't aware of that for most of my life. Okay. Then the next step is ownership. We have to own it. And ownership is I have to own the fact that that emotion has actually kept me stuck and it's created damage in my life, right? So for example, shame, where it could create damage, okay? My wife would ask me a simple question like, hey, what are we gonna do with the kids this weekend? My shame would filter that through its own little lens, and I would hear that through a lens of shame, through a filter of shame. So what did I actually hear? My wife said, hey, what are we doing with the kids this weekend? What I would hear is, you've not been a good enough husband and father, and what are you gonna do to make up for it on this weekend? That's what I hear. That's not what she said. So what happens? I channel the defensiveness because it's rooted in shame. And I told you husband and father is the first thing to me, right? And then my defensiveness gets covered up with a little bit of anger and temper, and I react and respond real quick. And I rattle off the 10 things I've done in the last 4 days to show I'm a good husband and father.
None of us do that, Brian. I don't know what you're talking about.
Yeah, right? So I react that's in a strong emotion, but guess what I've now done? I've caused my wife's armor to go up.
Right.
I created damage. She doesn't trust me in those moments because she asked an innocent, future-focused question, and I answered it because of my own emotional trigger, right? So I had to own the fact that I've created damage in my world, and owning it is not just that it has, it's also ownership in creating repair.
Right.
So where you've anticipated that you've created damage, or there's been other damage that you know of, repair is where we start to become free from it, because that's what removes the resistance and energy drain from what takes place with damage. Now, these are the first 2 steps. I would argue that most people can get through these steps without any other guidance or facilitation. And when I say these 2 steps that follow, this is not a pitch to hire us as coaching. 98% of people aren't ready for coaching, okay? Reality of it is though, these are the next steps that are critical for us all to understand as a society. Unroot is where it gets to. Right? We need to unroot the source or sources of that emotion. We have to literally unroot the whole thing. Now, have you ever done weeding before, brother? Mm-hmm. You've pulled weeds?
Yep.
Okay. Have you done it in gravel?
I don't think I've done it in gravel, but definitely like
Just
grass.
in the lawn? Just in the lawn?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so I'm going to use both examples because both are real. Now, we're in Arizona. The ground gets really hard here, and we grow a lot of weeds out of the ground. Well, the ground is so damn hard that you go to pull that weed, and the top just comes right off.
Right.
Right? What happens in the lawn? Well, most of us look at it and we're like, well, the weeds are green, the grass is green. We just mow over it. We might do some weed treatment, but we're not typically going out and unrooting out of our lawn. We just mow over it. We just mow over it. Right? Here's what happens though. It keeps coming back. That weed literally keeps coming back, right? The root keeps getting stronger. The root keeps getting deeper. The top keeps growing back smaller and smaller, and we just keep chopping it off. Okay, guess what? It's not until you actually pull out the entire root of that weed that it doesn't grow back anymore. Or you kill the root, either one.
So what's the process of unrooting?
You got to get to the source of that emotion, okay? So for me, I'll give you one, right? One of the other things that I had to unpack was anger. Again, anger was a secondary emotion. So I had to understand it through the lens of shame after I really got to the bottom of it. But one of the roots of my anger was my accident. Right. Was the fact that I've got 2 hours every single day that I have to get my body moving every single day. And I was blind to it because I was just doing it. I was living. But I was constantly being triggered and anger because of my original accident that I never felt anger around. I'm talking anger buried so deep it could barely be excavated, brother. I didn't even know it was there, okay? But the reality of it is getting to the root, I had to understand that because it's only in those moments that I can know that the anger in those moments has nothing to do with what's right in front of me. It has to do with what took place 29 years ago. Our triggers literally transport us into a different state and place than where we are real time. So when my wife would ask me those questions or she'd ask me something about the dishwasher, I wouldn't be reacting to her. I'd be reacting to how my grandma looked at me when I was 5. And how I never loaded the dishwasher correctly. Right? And so here's the thing, like we have to understand where the pattern of these emotions come from. And that's why the root is so important. Because guess what? When we actually pull out that whole root, we've got an empty hole and we can look at that as bad, or we can look at it as a hole to fill with fresh soil, fresh material, with the things that we want to grow. So when we unroot, we have to get to the root or roots so that we can understand it. Now, for me, I have multiple roots of my shame and I have multiple roots of my anger. The root is important because that's the only way that we go to the last step, is to move. How does the emotion move through our body? How does it move through our worlds? And how do we move through it?
I like that. Okay. Say that again. That was good.
How does it move through our body? How does it move through our world? And how do we move through it? Because this is where transformation starts to take place in emotions. When I say move through my body, I'm loud and I talk fast. Anybody who's been listening to this has probably already figured that out. Guess what? That's who I am. Okay. I'm sorry if you have to listen to this at half speed to actually understand what I say. I really genuinely apologize, but I want to give so much value. I'm going to keep talking at the cadence with which I operate. Okay. But how many times in a business meeting did somebody lean over and be like, shh, you can't talk that way.
Slow down, Brian. No one can understand you.
Right. And how many times did I shrink down in shame, literally bite my tongue, and immediately lose confidence in those moments because who I was wasn't good enough.
I agree.
It didn't fit the mold. It didn't fit the box. Okay. So that's how it moved in my body in one way of shame. I already talked to you about another way that it moved in my body, right? With anger, right? It would literally bubble up through defensiveness and this. Shame is the ultimate wolf in sheep's clothing because it literally shows up and masks itself as every other emotion. Perfectionism, fear, guilt, worth, scarcity, all of it. Perfectionism, control, temper, they're all, like a lot of those tie back to shame, right? And so I had to understand that. This is how it moves through my body. But I have to know, how does shame move through my body and how does it move through my body? Different scenarios. I just gave you 2 examples, okay? I have 5 or 6 different ways that shame moves through my body. I have to understand that first. Because once I understand how it moves through my body, I can identify it as that emotion. And now I can start understanding how it moves in my world, meaning where do I get triggered? Okay? I have over 50 shame triggers. I have over 60 anger triggers.
You've counted?
I created a list. I don't know the exact number
You've
anymore.
created a list.
I stopped counting at that number, right? But I have over 50. Well, now it's where I start pairing how it moves through my body to the thing that triggered me, how it moves in my world, to actually be able to pause in those moments, take a breath, and ask myself, is what I'm experiencing right now connected to this moment, or is it connected to the root of this emotion? It allows us to create new patterns in that moment. It's in those moments when we create that awareness that we start filling those holes with soil, because that's when we start recreating new patterns. That's how we move through it. We have to be able to understand how it moves in our body. where we get triggered by it, how it moves in our world, and start creating those patterns. So in those moments, we can see it very clearly, right? So great example, as I unpacked my anger, right? Anger for me can show up in a few different ways. Sometimes it can literally just be an energetic edge, an edge. Like I'm not reacting, but it's just an edge. It's like everything's annoying me. I feel like I'm on sensory overload. Well, guess what? When I go into sensory overload that's based in my edge and anger, it makes me want to bottle up and do this. Makes me want to have my own space. My kid is on the autism spectrum. He has no personal boundaries. He will climb all over me, and it'll be like on a whim too, because of his impulse control and lack thereof. Okay. So I'm in this place, and all of a sudden my son jumps on my lap because he loves me. He wants to be with me. Guess what? That's a trigger for me, which would cause a reaction, because I'd be like, "Wait, get off of me." He didn't do anything wrong.
Right.
We're trying to teach him boundaries, but that's a neurological wiring piece that he can't prevent. But I know that that's now a trigger in how it moves in me. So when I feel that edge, I don't sit down next to my son, or I communicate with him. "Hey, dad's got an edge right now. Can you just try to be careful to control your body?" Two things have happened there. I've already committed to where I'm at, so he knows. And two, I've anticipated that I might react, so he's already on warning. So if I do, we don't create conflict. It's like, yep, dad was on edge. I'm just gonna take a little bit more space. I have to be aware so I can take back control of those moments versus having those moments control me. Because I believe that all triggers are designed to be pulled. So you can either allow your emotional triggers to pull you, causing you to react and create damage, or you can pull the trigger on your emotional triggers, causing you to respond and repair.
I want to be sensitive and honor your time because we only have a few more minutes, and I want to really respect that. But you talk a lot about sustainable growth and lasting personal change.
Yep.
And I like this: awareness, own it, unroot, and move. But let's say we do that one time. Let's say we work through that either on our own or through coaching on a specific subject matter. And I love how you identified all of the triggers, whether, shame and all that. Such a great exercise to do. How do you make it sustainable? What's at the root of making this sustainable? Is it routine? Is it this constant loop that you create of like, okay, feeling, awareness, let's readdress it, right? Awareness, own it, unroot, and move, and just constant keep, like, how do you create a sustainable lifestyle to have this type of mindset?
Yeah, so it's absolutely through consistency. And I'm going to tell you, it's hard.
Yeah, that's right. It's work.
Like, it is literally the hardest work we can do, but it's also the most rewarding. Because here's the beautiful part. If we are consistent over a period of time, we don't get triggered the same way.
Yeah, that's true.
And so we have to remain consistent. And to your point, it's a little bit of this loop. Now, wherever we can do this loop real time, the better. But wherever we can do this loop, even daily or weekly at a minimum, helps us make progress. So what I mean by that is sometimes I'll get triggered, but I don't choose to do anything different in that moment.
Right.
Other than remain neutral and not react, right? Like, my goal is to not create damage. So I'm often trying to put myself in a position where I don't react. Sometimes I will, so I'll create repair. But where I was going with that is, we can be doing these things and we'll get triggered. It's not always the right time to unpack it then. And so I'm not a believer in compartmentalizing. I am a believer in creating containers. And what the difference is to me is compartmentalizing is literally putting something in a sealed box, putting it up on the shelf in your closet, and you don't look at it for 5 years. Whereas a container, you open regularly, right? So a container, right, is a cereal box. It's a milk jug. It's a container that you are designed to open regularly. So my containers are not to be put away and ignored. They're to be revisited within 24 to 48 hours from me. Sometimes it's a week. So you may have said something earlier, you didn't, by the way, that triggered me. And clearly we're in a mode of podcast where we're creating content. This is not the time to pause and address that, right? But it may be something that's worthwhile for you and I to have a conversation about, or for me just to be aware of.
Right.
So I'll put it in a container. And then later in the day, I'll go back and I'll revisit those containers.
I love
so
that.
The sustainability through this is through consistency. It is through actually going through this own loop. How it becomes truly sustainable outside of yourself, though, is when you start living this way, you give permission to those in your world to live the same way. Now all of a sudden you just start communicating around this, and you start actually creating partnership. So my wife and I now are empowering each other to work through this real time with each other by being external awareness. And we've established the amount of trust and intimacy that we don't get triggered when the other person brings an awareness moment to each other.
Right.
Now, for 14 years, anything we'd say that was awareness moments would trigger the hell out of us, right? But now we're getting to a place because we are trusting, we are protecting each other. We feel safe, seen and understood and connected. And when that doesn't happen, we're addressing it real time so that we both can be sustainable, not only in ourselves, but in our marriage and in our family household. Now our kids are doing this. Look at what I told you. My son went and created Repair.
Right.
Okay. Now, by the way, 18 months ago, none of this would have been possible in our household.
Right.
So I want to be really clear. Like, I'm not sitting here like, oh, we did it.
We solved the problem.
It's hard.
No, right.
This shit
It's
is
work.
hard.
It's work.
But I can tell you that anger, I unpacked 9 months ago. I can't tell you the last time I felt angry. It's probably been a month. Now I'll get triggered in moments where I'll feel it, but
Sure.
I can now also understand what it is. I am no longer confined or constrained by my emotions. The shackles of my shame have been removed. Now, here's the thing. These emotions will be adversaries in constant pursuit for the rest of our lives because they were conditioned into us. They are patterned, they are triggers, and they are deep. So all we can ever do is hope that the impact of them is not negative in our lives and that we are triggered by them less and less. And so what I will say is, with consistency around this, over the course of months, you can reclaim your life. I mean, I have a client that dealt with such a deep level of trauma, had her walls up around her to the point that nobody even knew what took place 30 years ago in her world, including her husband, right? She was on sleep medications, antidepressants, all of these things, was drinking excessively to numb, had no relationships, didn't believe human connection was possible. She's gone through this process, and over the course of 10 months, she's off of all of her sleep medications. She's reduced all of her antidepressants down to the lowest minimal dose. Her drinking has changed. She's lost 70 pounds. Her relationship with her husband is now significantly improved, and their business is starting to grow as a result. The reality of it is that she was consistent. She constantly would pause and stop, and she would put things in containers that if she wasn't able to unpack herself, we'd unpack on our regular coaching calls. Right. So if you don't have somebody to unpack it with you, or you don't see it, talk to a friend, mentor, coach, go see a therapist. That's right. Again, this isn't a pitch to hire me for a coach. Most people aren't ready. Right. But it's about giving intention around this process of not only communication internally with yourself, but communication with those in your world.
Embrace that pain.
Embrace the pain, and you will avoid suffering. That's a guarantee.
So good. So good. You could just keep going. You could just keep going.
Well, I have to go.
Look, man, again, I so appreciate you and so much support and blessings to you and your journey and helping 1 billion people create impact. So I just love you so much. I appreciate your time, and I'm here for you in any way I can. And just thanks for serving.
Well, dude, thank you for creating a platform to pour good in the world. It's the only reason I had the chance to be with you today. And so I'm grateful for that. And again, I'm sure that anybody who listens will find ways to connect with us. We genuinely want to help. And we know that 99.999% of those billion will never pay us $1. So, you said it earlier, we put a lot of free content out, man. I just ask that if anybody's moved by this, go do something about it, because moved people move people.
That's right.
And I just really want to make sure that we can continue to have this ripple effect go for generations.
If you're looking for Brian, go to brianbogert.com. We'll put all your social media links and everything in the podcast recording. And you're pretty easy to get a hold of. You're even on social, you're pretty responsive. So if anyone wants to get a hold of Brian and reach out, I really encourage you to do so. And he has so much great, valuable content online for free. So you have no excuses. So again, brother, thank you so much. I honor you, and I love you. Thanks.
Thank you, Ashish.